Is single channel enough, or do you really need dual channel? Or maybe quad channel, or maybe 6 channel, or maybe 8 channel, or maybe 10 channel, or laptop memory?
Okay, maybe I won't go that far, but what actually is the difference between single and dual channel? Running your RAM in dual channels is universally recommended, but sometimes you don't really have a choice. Money isn't unlimited for most of us, and some situations like whatever's currently happening can make RAM unaffordable for everyone. Yes, even those who generally don't care about instant prices. Thanks AI, dual channel in theory doubles your memory bandwidth, making transfers between CPU and RAM a lot faster. There is a benefit to having two sticks, and more isn't necessarily better depending on your memory controller, but that isn't the subject. But you are stuck with one stick. What are you missing on? Well, that's gonna depend on your processor and its architecture. Most of them will be affected quite a bit, while some will see less of a difference. And then there are the X3D CPUs that will likely see the smallest jump in performance due to their large cache. There might also be a difference between DDR4 and DDR5 as the bandwidth is a fair bit higher there. All of that said, I will test 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM both in single and dual channel. Both configurations will be running close to the specs of the single channel sticks, though with worse timings, and the frequency is 3200 MHz with primary timings of 18, 22, 22 and 48. Secondary and tertiary timings were slightly different as the sticks really didn't like running at the same exact ones. The graphics card used is a 66700XT and the CPU L12400F, so 12th to 14th gen should see the similar results. The first game I tested was Battlefield 6, and just getting in game with single channel felt wrong. The framerate was lower than I remembered. I lowered the settings from the maximum to high, but it still kinda felt wrong. But still, on a full server, single channel ran at 50 FPS average with 1% of 24. When I switched to dual channel though, I thought I did something wrong, and honestly I'm not entirely sure. But the frame rate nearly doubled, average went up to 98 and 1% to 55. I followed the same path on the same map and the same amount of players, and yet the difference is still massive. I know this game is CPU demanding, but dual channel greatly improved this game. Next up is Rust, a game that is increasingly more demanding, but especially loves RAM. It used to run with 4GB of RAM and a hard drive just fine, but now 16GB is the minimum you want to even go in-game alongside an SSD, unless you want to spend literally an hour loading in. With a single stick, the game ran at 106 average and 1%. It wasn't that stuttery though, in contrary to what the 1% say. But once again, dual channel improved them a fair bit. The average frame rate didn't improve that much, only jumping to 119. But the 1% went up to 54. This was on a low pop server, so I could test in peace, and though dual channel had slightly more players, it also had better frame rate. Red Dead Redemption is next, and this game was GPU bound as I tested with high settings, but that shouldn't matter that much as 1% lows should improve anyway. And being on the same engine as GTA 5, I did expect at least a slight difference. But the differences were pretty much within margin of error, both for the average and the 1% that were 58 and 30 versus 61 and 34. There is an improvement, but it is extremely small, and more benchmark runs will probably close the gap even more. This game would much rather run a strong GPU than CPU. 7 Days to Die is next, and this game spent about a decade in alpha, and it still wasn't enough time to optimize it. No matter the computer, it will run fairly badly and stutter a fair bit, especially as the world loads in. Due to that, I expected somewhat of a difference as the GPU pretty much sits idle no matter what your settings are. With a single stick of RAM, the average frame rate was of 91 and the 1% of 29, while dual channel brought up to 106 and 34. Not much of a difference, but it's still there, although less than expected. These numbers also show how bad the game runs. The 1% are just abysmal when compared to the averages. Cyberpunk is a game known to be fairly heavy on the CPU, but at max settings, without any ray tracing, it was still too GPU bound to show any sort of difference. It pretty much didn't change. Single channel averaged 63 with 1% of 38, and dual was at 65 and 38. I would have expected a slightly bigger difference as the game is still fairly CPU demanding, but at the settings I used, it didn't really matter. From this point on, the results though are going to get a bit more interesting. Grand Theft Auto 5 Legacy is a decently CPU-bound game, especially with modern GPUs, and it's overall easy to run on most computers, even lower-end ones from the time. Hell, I played this with a Q6600 and a 9500 GT, even if the settings were at the lowest. Over 3 runs, the average frame rate for single channel was of 130, and the 1% of 54. When I moved on to dual channel, the difference was quite surprising. And we are seeing a similar jump to Battlefield. With averages of 160 and 1% of 84, the game was now hitting the frame rate at which the game engine gets all weird and sort of limited, but isn't really. The next game I tested is Far Cry 5, because that's the latest one I own. The benchmark took way too long to load in, so I only ran it twice, but the frame rates were consistent enough between runs. This game is also decently GPU bound, but I did see a small improvement. The average with single channel was of 99 with 1% of 61, while dual channel was of 117 and 75. The 1% saw a nice improvement, although on the lower side compared to others. I also think with a better GPU the averages could be a fair bit higher. Strike 2 is next, and not really the best optimized game, considering what it is. It is also one of the 2 games on this list that I tested using low settings, as that's what I use in-game, with a resolution of 1024x768. I benchmarked the deathmatch mode as it just runs horribly, and in single channel the results were of 147 and 66, while dual channel were 195 and 104. Another decent jump in frame rate, though not really unexpected with this game. It's still a great jump, and from testing this game in general, the frame rate is very sensitive to RAM speed. As from previous testing, even a boost of 100 MHz boosts the frame rate by about 10%. Next is Hitman 3. I know this game is fairly CPU intensive, but I still didn't really expect a massive difference between the two. Still using the maximum settings and using the game's benchmark, as it is itself an CPU test, the single channel results were of 77 and 33 versus 112 and 46. Another nice jump for the average and smoother gameplay overall. Not that it matters much with this kind of frame rates and this game though, but it's still nice to have smoother gameplay. And then finally Fortnite, another quite CPU intensive game. This one was also tested with low settings, making the CPU the bottleneck. This one also saw a nice jump in performance, going from 134 and 73 to 199 and 114. This is a pretty nice jump, and since the game is fairly competitive, it will lead to a bit of an advantage compared to single channel. But single channel wasn't that unplayable either. I mean, I won the one game I played when getting the demo recording for the benchmark. Unlike most of my kills went, but I think the last one wasn't. So, is dual channel worth it? Well, while there were some massive differences for some games, the one example I'd say absolutely requires dual channel is Battlefield 6. If you play anything else, especially with high settings, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Competitive games, however, that are pretty CPU demanding, also saw some great improvements, and with high refresh rate monitors, these frames really contribute to smoothness. Running a 400 monitor myself, I'd want at least 300 FPS with those games, and RAM speed is a fair bit important with these games. But none of that matters if you have a computer right now. I'm sure you have 2 sticks at least, but in the current environment, if you are building a new computer, I guess you could get one stick now and the other in like 10 years maybe, when the prices start to go back down. In the meantime, you won't miss out on much, unless you want frames as high as possible in competitive games, or play Battlefield 6, I guess.